His dangerous obsession. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love. Not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was forced into a marriage that was never meant for her, she realized something dangerous. There was only one man who could protect her. And he was the man she had once betrayed. Marcello Ricci looked at her, unreadable. Then slowly he smiled. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm available." Chapter 1. The Shattered Legacy of Silence. The rain lashed against the stained glass windows of the DeSantis family mausoleum, each drop a percussive echo of the grief that clawed at Alessia's throat. It was a relentless, unforgiving downpour, mirroring the tempest brewing within her. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, mingled with the damp earth and the lingering aroma of old money and older secrets. Her father, Don Antonio DeSantis, lay in his final resting place, a cold, marble edifice that did little to reflect the vibrant, terrifying man he had been. Alessia knelt, her black dress pooling around her on the cold stone floor, the fabric a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. Her fingers, usually adorned with rings passed down through generations, were bare, the jewelry feeling too ostentatious, too celebratory for this day of mourning. She traced the carved inscription of his name, the smooth, cold marble offering no comfort. Antonio DeSantis. Beloved father. Powerful leader. Lies all of it. Or at least, half-truths carved in stone. A public facade for a private reality far more complex. Beloved? She whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. He had been loved, yes, by his family, by his men, by the terrified populace who benefited from his protection. But beloved by her? That was a question she couldn't answer. Not yet. The grief was too fresh, too raw, a gaping wound where her heart used to be. Her father had been a force of nature, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had ruled his empire with an iron fist, his word law, his judgment swift and often brutal. Alessia had grown up in the shadow of that power, witnessing the dark underbelly of their opulent life. The whispered conversations, the hushed phone calls, the men with cold eyes and even colder hands who frequented their villa. She had learned early to keep silent, to observe, to become a ghost in her own home. A necessary skill for survival. A sob escaped her, a choked, strangled sound that was quickly swallowed by the storm raging outside. She pressed her forehead against the cold marble, the chill seeping into her bones, a welcome distraction from the burning ache in her chest. She hadn't cried at the funeral, standing stoic and composed beside her brothers, Marco and Lorenzo. She hadn't cried when the condolences poured in, a river of insincere platitudes from men who were likely already plotting to seize her father's power. She had saved her tears for this, for the solitude of the mausoleum, where the ghosts of her ancestors could bear witness to her grief. A hand, large and calloused, touched her shoulder, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold stone. Alessia flinched, startled, but didn't look up. She knew that touch.
Marco.
Her eldest brother, the heir apparent, the one who now bore the weight of their father's legacy. Alessia, he said, his voice rough with emotion, but laced with the steely undertone that had always characterized him. It's time to go. She shook her head, her dark hair, usually meticulously styled, falling loose around her shoulders.
Not yet.
Marco sighed, a sound of weary resignation. The others are waiting. The arrangements need to be discussed. The arrangements. The euphemism for the brutal power struggle that was about to unfold. Her father's death had left a vacuum, a void that would be filled by blood and betrayal. She knew that, had always known it. It was the way of their world. Let them wait, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Let them plot. Let them scheme. For once, I don't care. Marco knelt beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight in the vast emptiness of the mausoleum. He didn't speak for a long moment, the silence punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. He loved you, Alessia, he said finally, his voice softer now, stripped of the usual authority.
In his own way.
Alessia closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek.
His own way.
A way that had involved fear, control, and a constant, suffocating pressure to conform. A way that had left her feeling like a bird in a gilded cage, beautiful, but utterly powerless. "I know," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she did. She knew he had protected her, shielded her from the worst of their world. But protection at what cost? A sudden, sharp gust of wind rattled the doors of the mausoleum, a violent intrusion that broke the fragile stillness. Alessia shivered, not from the cold, but from a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. Marco stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "Come," he said. "We can't stay here any longer." She allowed him to lead her out of the mausoleum, back into the storm, back into the world that had just irrevocably changed. As they walked towards the waiting cars, a sleek black line of power and mourning, Alessia glanced back at the mausoleum, a cold, imposing structure silhouetted against the stormy sky. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her father's death was not the end, but the beginning of a new, more dangerous chapter in her life. A chapter where the rules had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever before. And the most terrifying part was that she had no idea who she could trust. Not even her own brothers. The thought clung to her, cold and heavy, a premonition of the darkness to come. Chapter 2. Whispers in the shadows of the past. The villa, usually a hive of activity, felt eerily silent. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, casting the grand rooms into a perpetual twilight. The air, thick with the scent of expensive cigars and unspoken anxieties, seemed to press down on Alessia, making it difficult to breathe. The usual retinue of servants moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled on the thick Persian rugs, their voices hushed to whispers. The meeting was held in her father's study, a room that still reeked of his presence. The massive mahogany desk, the leather-bound books lining the walls, the imposing portrait of her grandfather, the founder of their dynasty, everything screamed of power and legacy. A legacy that Alessia was now inextricably bound to, whether she wanted it or not. Marco sat at the head of the table, his face grim, his eyes scanning the assembled men. Lorenzo, her younger brother, sat to his right, his youthful features marred by a deep frown. He was the impulsive one, the hothead, prone to rash decisions and fueled by a fiery temper. Alessia sat to Marco's left, feeling strangely detached, an observer in a play she didn't want to be a part of. Around the table were the capos, the lieutenants of their father's organization. Men with hard eyes and harder hearts, men who had built their fortunes on loyalty and violence. Sal DeMarco, a grizzled veteran with a network of informants that stretched across the city. Tony the Knife Bellini, known for his ruthlessness and his particular skill set. And a handful of others, each with their own territory, their own specialty, their own ambition. The discussion was a carefully choreographed dance of veiled threats and unspoken alliances. They spoke of respect, of tradition, of maintaining order. But beneath the surface, Alessia could sense the simmering tension, the hunger for power that gnawed at each of them. Her father's death had unleashed a pack of wolves, and they were all circling, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. "The Falcone family has been making inquiries," Sal DeMarco said, his voice a low growl. "They're sniffing around, testing the waters." The Falcones. They're longtime rivals, a family with a history of bad blood and bitter feuds with the DeSantis clan. Their interest was not unexpected, but it was unwelcome. "They're vultures," Lorenzo spat, his hand instinctively going to the gun he always carried beneath his jacket. "They'll be dealt with." Marco held up a hand, silencing his brother. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We can't afford a war right now. Not while we're consolidating."
Consolidating.
Another euphemism. This time for the internal power struggle that was playing out within their own family. Marco was the obvious successor, but he lacked his father's ruthlessness, his absolute authority. And there were whispers, rumors of discontent, of some who believed Lorenzo, with his fiery temper and his willingness to use violence, would be a stronger leader. Alessia listened, her mind drifting. She had always been on the periphery of these discussions, her role defined by her gender, her perceived fragility. She was the daughter, the sister, the pawn to be used in strategic alliances. Her marriage had been arranged years ago, a union designed to solidify their family's ties with the powerful Moretti family. A marriage that was now looming, a dark cloud on the horizon. A sudden, sharp pain pierced her chest, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered that carefully constructed plan. A betrayal that had involved her, a secret she had guarded fiercely, a secret that now threatened to unravel everything. She looked up, her eyes meeting Marco's across the table. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Did he know? Had he always known? The thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine. The meeting dragged on, the arguments and counter-arguments swirling around her like a suffocating fog. Alessia felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, a desperate need to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the room. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. The sudden movement startled the assembled men, their conversations dying down, their eyes turning to her. "I need some air," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Marco frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Alessia, I'll be fine," she said, cutting him off. "Just give me a few minutes." She didn't wait for his permission, turning and walking quickly out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. She needed to breathe, to think, to find some semblance of control in the chaos that was engulfing her. She walked out onto the terrace, the cool night air a welcome relief on her flushed skin. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a shimmering, ethereal mist that clung to the gardens below. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a glittering panorama of life and activity that seemed a world away from the dark, suffocating world she inhabited. She leaned against the railing, her hands gripping the cold stone, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She was trapped, caught in a web of obligations and expectations, with no escape in sight. Or was there? A flicker of defiance, a spark of rebellion, ignited within her. She was a DeSantis.
She was not weak.
She would not be a pawn. She would find a way to survive, to protect herself, to forge her own destiny. Even if it meant breaking all the rules. Even if it meant confronting the one man who held the key to her future, the man she had once betrayed. The image of Marcello Ricci, his dark eyes and enigmatic smile, flashed in her mind, a dangerous and alluring promise. A promise she was not sure she could resist. The night held its breath, waiting. Chapter 3. A marriage forged in desperation. The summons arrived the next morning, delivered by one of Marco's men, a taciturn individual with eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. It was a simple note, written on heavy cream-colored paper with the Ricci family crest embossed in gold at the top. No flowery language, no polite formalities. Just a time and a place. The Palazzo Ricci. 3 p.m.
Come alone.
Alessia stared at the note, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had known this was coming, had anticipated it, dreaded it. But the reality of it, the stark simplicity of the summons, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The Palazzo Ricci. Marcello's domain. A place steeped in history, power, and a darkness that rivaled her own family's. She had been there only once, years ago, for a formal dinner, a carefully orchestrated event designed to showcase the alliance between the DeSantis and Ricci families. An alliance that had been shattered by her actions. She crumpled the note in her hand, the expensive paper crinkling under the pressure of her grip. She had to go. She had no choice. Her father's death, the precariousness of her family's position, the looming threat of the Falcons, all of it conspired to force her hand. Marco had made it clear, in his own subtle way, that her marriage to Marcello was no longer a strategic alliance, but a necessity. A desperate attempt to secure their family's survival. The thought of marrying Marcello sent a shiver of conflicting emotions through her. Fear, yes, but also a strange, unsettling sense of anticipation. He was a dangerous man, she knew that. Ruthless, cunning, and utterly unpredictable. He had a reputation for being cold and calculating, a man who showed no mercy, who held grudges like precious jewels. And she had given him every reason to hate her. She spent the morning in a state of restless agitation, pacing her room, unable to focus on anything. She tried to read, to lose herself in the pages of a book, but the words swam before her eyes, meaningless and empty. She tried to sketch, her fingers usually finding solace in the movement of charcoal on paper, but her hand trembled, the lines jagged and distorted. She finally gave up, throwing the sketchbook across the room in frustration. She needed to prepare, to steel herself for the confrontation that awaited her. She needed to find a way to navigate the treacherous waters of her relationship with Marcelo, to convince him to help her, to protect her. She chose her clothes carefully, opting for a simple black dress, elegant but understated. No jewelry, no makeup, nothing that could be construed as an attempt to seduce or manipulate. She wanted to present herself as vulnerable, yes, but also as strong, as someone who was not easily intimidated. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back at her. A woman haunted by shadows, burdened by secrets, and facing an uncertain future. The Alessia she had once been, the carefree, naive girl, was gone, replaced by someone hardened by loss and betrayal. The drive to the Palazzo Ricci was a blur. The city streets, usually vibrant and teeming with life, seemed muted, distant. She sat in the back of the black sedan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, her mind racing. The palazzo was even more imposing than she remembered. A massive stone structure, centuries old, with towering walls and ornate gates. It exuded an aura of power and wealth, a silent testament to the Ricci family's long and bloody history. The car pulled up to the entrance, and a uniformed guard opened the door for her. Alessia stepped out, her legs feeling unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. She was led through a series of grand hallways, each more opulent than the last. The walls were adorned with priceless artwork, the floors covered with intricate mosaics, the ceilings soaring high above, decorated with elaborate frescoes. The air was heavy with the scent of old money and ancient secrets. Finally, she was ushered into a large, dimly lit room. It was a library, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And standing in front of the fireplace, his back to her, was Marcelo Ricci. He turned as she entered, his movements slow and deliberate. He was taller than she remembered, his presence filling the room. He was dressed in a dark suit, impeccably tailored, that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his gaze. His eyes, the color of dark chocolate, met hers, and Alessia felt a jolt of electricity run through her. They were unreadable, those eyes, giving nothing away. But she could sense the power that simmered beneath the surface, the controlled intensity that made him so dangerous. He didn't speak for a long moment, just studied her, his gaze raking over her from head to toe. Alessia felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite define. "You came," he said finally, his voice a low, velvety murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "I had no choice," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. He smiled then, a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He gestured to a chair in front of the fireplace.
Seat.
Alessia hesitated for a moment, then walked towards the chair, her movements stiff and awkward. She sat down, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcelo remained standing, watching her, his silence more unnerving than any words could have been. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, the flames dancing and twisting, mirroring the turmoil within her. She knew she was walking into a trap, a carefully laid snare designed to bind her to him forever. But she also knew she had no other option. Her life, her family's future, depended on it. The fire crackled, a hungry sound in the silence. Chapter 4. The Unseen Scars of Marcello Ricci. Marcello moved with a deliberate grace, circling the chair where Alessia sat, like a predator assessing its prey. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter on a nearby table, the clinking of glass the only sound breaking the tense silence. He offered her one, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. Amaro, he said, his voice a low rumble. A digestive. To settle the nerves. Alessia took the glass, her hand trembling slightly. She took a small sip, the bitter, complex flavors coating her tongue. It did little to calm the storm raging within her. He watched her, his dark eyes inscrutable, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. You look different, he said finally, his gaze lingering on her face. Older. Harder. Grief does that to a person, she replied, her voice tight. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the fire, his expression momentarily softening. Yes, he said quietly. It does. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their shared past. Alessia knew he was waiting for her to speak, to explain, to plead. But she refused to give him the satisfaction. She would not grovel. She would not beg. My father is dead, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. My family is vulnerable. You know why I'm here. He turned back to her, his eyes narrowing.
Doi?
He asked, his voice laced with a subtle challenge. Enlighten me. Alessia took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Marriage, she said, the word feeling like a stone in her throat.
En alliance.
Protection. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Protection? He repeated, his eyebrows raising. From whom? The Falcons? Your own brothers? She flinched at the accuracy of his words. He knew, of course. He knew everything. He had always been one step ahead, anticipating every move, every threat. Both, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He took a sip of his Amaro, his gaze never leaving hers. And what makes you think I would agree to such an arrangement? He asked, his voice soft, but edged with steel. After what you did. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The betrayal. The secret that had driven a wedge between them, that had shattered the carefully constructed alliance between their families. Alessia's heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweating. She had to choose her words carefully. One wrong move, one misspoken word, and she could lose everything. I was young, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Foolish. I made a mistake. A mistake? He repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. You call it a mistake? You ran off with Lorenzo Bellini, eloped with the son of one of our enemies, days before our arranged wedding. A mistake makes it sound like a spilled glass of wine. This was arson, Alessia. You burned everything to the ground. The memory of that time, of her reckless infatuation with Lorenzo Bellini, flooded back, bringing with it a wave of shame and regret. She had been young, impulsive, blinded by a passion that had quickly turned sour. She had believed she was in love, that she was escaping the suffocating constraints of her family, of her arranged marriage. She had been wrong. I know, she said, her voice barely audible. And I've paid the price. Every day. The elopement had been short-lived. Lorenzo Bellini had been charming, exciting, everything Marcello was not. But his charm had been a facade, hiding a cruel, possessive nature. She had quickly realized her mistake, had returned home, broken and humiliated, to face the consequences of her actions. Her father had been furious, his pride wounded, his plans ruined. He had never forgiven her. And Marcello had never said a word. He had simply withdrawn, his silence more damning than any accusation. He had watched her, his eyes cold and distant, as she navigated the wreckage of her life. You haven't paid enough, he said, his voice now holding an undercurrent of something she couldn't name. It wasn't anger.
It was darker than that. Deeper.
He moved closer, his presence overwhelming, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something subtly dangerous, filling her senses. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. But perhaps, he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm on her skin. Perhaps there is a way you can make amends. His eyes held hers, a dark, intense gaze that seemed to strip away her defenses, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, dancing on the edge of a precipice. But she had no other choice. She was trapped, bound to him by fate, by desperation, and by the lingering embers of a past that refused to be extinguished. She saw a flicker, just a brief one, of something else in his eyes. Something other than cold calculation. It was gone so fast, she might have imagined it. But it gave her the smallest sliver of hope. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her predicament. Chapter 5. Echoes of Betrayal and Regret. Alessia held her breath, the weight of Marcello's gaze, his proximity, almost unbearable. His words hung in the air, a veiled promise, a dangerous proposition. Make amends. The phrase echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the debt she owed him, the price she had yet to pay. What do you mean? She asked, her voice a strained whisper, her throat constricting with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling anticipation. He didn't answer immediately, his fingers still tracing the line of her jaw, his touch light but possessive. He moved closer, his body almost touching hers, his presence dominating the space between them. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the subtle, intoxicating scent of his cologne. Marriage, he said finally, his voice a low, resonant murmur that vibrated through her. But not the kind you envision. Not a mere alliance, a strategic partnership. A real marriage, Alessia. In every sense of the word. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. A real marriage. The thought was both terrifying and strangely alluring. She had always known that her life would be dictated by duty, by obligation. But the idea of being bound to Marcello, of sharing his life, his bed, his secrets, sent a shiver of apprehension through her. She began, but her voice trailed off, her mind struggling to process the implications of his words. He smiled then, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Don't look so surprised, he said, his voice laced with amusement. You came here seeking protection, seeking an alliance. I'm simply clarifying the terms.
But why?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. After everything, why would you want this? He leaned in closer, his lips almost brushing her ear. Revenge, Kara, he whispered, his breath warm on her skin. And perhaps something more. Revenge. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had expected anger, resentment, even hatred. But revenge that implied a deliberate, calculated cruelty, a desire to inflict pain. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. He straightened, his expression shifting, becoming more guarded. You will, he said. In time. He moved away from her, walking back towards the fireplace, his back to her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. Alessia watched him, her mind racing, trying to decipher his motives, to understand the game he was playing. You betrayed me, Alessia, he said, his voice low and controlled, but laced with an undercurrent of pain that surprised her. You humiliated me. You broke my trust. She closed her eyes, the weight of his words crushing her. She had never thought of it that way, had never considered the depth of his hurt. She had been so consumed by her own selfish desires, by her desperate need to escape, that she had failed to see the consequences of her actions. I know, she whispered, her voice choked with regret. And I'm sorry. He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. Are you? He asked, his voice soft, but probing. Truly sorry? She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of shame and remorse. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. I am. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded a slow, deliberate movement.
Good, he said.
Because apologies are insufficient. Actions are what matter. He walked towards her again, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense, his presence overwhelming. So, he said, his voice a low murmur, do we have an agreement? A marriage. A real marriage. In exchange for my protection, for my loyalty. Alessia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind reeling. She was trapped, cornered, with no escape in sight. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something beyond the revenge, beyond the cold calculation. She saw a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of loneliness, a longing that mirrored her own. And in that moment, she realized that she was not the only one who had been wounded by the past. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the decision that would change her life forever. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady. We have an agreement. His smile widened, a genuine smile this time, that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost human. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm but gentle. Then welcome, Alessia, he said, his voice laced with a subtle warmth that sent a shiver of anticipation through her. Welcome to the Ricci family. He raised her hand to his lips, brushing a light kiss against her knuckles. The gesture, so unexpected, so courtly, made her breath catch. The deal was sealed. The trap was sprung. And yet, as she looked into his dark, enigmatic eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just an ending, but a beginning. A very dangerous, very uncertain, very compelling beginning. The fire, having burned low, suddenly flared, casting a brighter, warmer light across the room. Chapter 6. Beneath the Veil of a Gilded Cage. The days following her agreement with Marcello were a whirlwind of activity, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to present a united front to the world. The announcement of their engagement was met with a mixture of surprise and subdued celebration. The alliance between the DeSantis and Ricci families, once shattered, was now seemingly restored, stronger than ever. Or so it appeared. Alessia found herself thrust into a world of opulent parties, lavish dinners, and endless social engagements. She was introduced to Marcello's inner circle, a collection of powerful and influential figures, each with their own agendas, their own secrets. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of their society, to smile and nod, to play the role of the dutiful fiancé, while concealing the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her. The Palazzo Ricci became her new home, a gilded cage, beautiful but confining. She was given a suite of rooms overlooking the sprawling gardens, a space filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and every luxury imaginable. But despite the opulence, she felt a constant sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, of being controlled. Marcello was a constant presence, his watchful eyes following her every move. He was attentive, courteous, even charming. He showered her with gifts, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, extravagant gestures that were meant to impress, to overwhelm. But beneath the surface, Alessia sensed a detachment, a coldness that kept her at arm's length. He rarely spoke of their agreement, of the real marriage he had demanded. He treated her with a possessive courtesy, a subtle assertion of his ownership, but he never crossed the line, never forced himself upon her. It was a strange, unsettling dynamic, a constant push and pull of power and control. She spent her days exploring the vast palazzo, discovering hidden courtyards, secret gardens, and dusty libraries filled with ancient books. She tried to find solace in the solitude, in the beauty that surrounded her, but the weight of her situation, the uncertainty of her future, always loomed, casting a shadow over everything. She often found herself drawn to the library, the same room where Marcello had made his proposition. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the palazzo, lose herself in the pages of a book, and forget, for a brief time, the reality of her situation. One afternoon, she was sitting by the fireplace, reading, when Marcello entered. He stood for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable, You seem to find comfort in this room, he said, his voice breaking the silence. Alessia looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. It's peaceful, she replied, her voice hesitant. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the bookshelves lining the walls. My grandfather built this library, he said. He was a scholar, a collector of rare books. A man of contradictions. Alessia sensed a hidden meaning in his words, a subtle reference to his own complex nature. She had learned that Marcello was a man of many layers, a man who concealed his true feelings beneath a mask of cold indifference. Contradictions? She asked, her curiosity piqued. He smiled, a fleeting, enigmatic smile. He was a ruthless businessman, a powerful leader, he said. But he also had a passion for art, for literature, for beauty. He believed that power, without culture, was meaningless. Alessia saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man beneath the carefully constructed facade. She wondered if he was speaking of himself, of the conflict between his public persona and his private desires. He moved closer, his presence filling the room. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. You remind me of him, he said, his voice a low murmur. Strong, resilient, but with a hidden depth. Alessia's heart skipped a beat. His words, his touch, sent a shiver of unexpected warmth through her. She had seen glimpses of his humanity, moments when the mask slipped, revealing a vulnerability that both intrigued and frightened her. I'm not sure that's a compliment, she said, trying to maintain a sense of detachment, to protect herself from the dangerous pull she felt towards him. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound.
It is, he said.
Trust me. He withdrew his hand, the brief contact leaving her skin tingling. He seemed to study the spines of the books, but she knew he was thinking about something else entirely. The silence stretched, and yet, this time, it wasn't the silence of accusation, but a different type. A waiting silence. He finally turned and with a quiet command said, Tonight. Dinner. Just the two of us. Then he left. Alessia watched the door close, wondering what this dinner truly meant. Chapter 7. The Weight of Unspoken Promises. The evening arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Alessia had spent the afternoon in a state of nervous preparation, choosing her dress with meticulous care, agonizing over every detail. She opted for a gown of deep emerald green, the color a subtle nod to the Ricci family crest, the fabric clinging to her curves in a way that was both elegant and alluring. She wanted to appear confident, composed, in control, but beneath the surface, she was a tempest of conflicting emotions. She knew this dinner was more than just a meal. It was a test, a challenge, a step further into the intricate dance of power and desire that defined her relationship with Marcello. He had said a real marriage, and while he hadn't pressed the issue physically, she knew that tonight, the unspoken promises that hung between them would be addressed. She descended the grand staircase, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand gripping the polished banister for support. The palazzo was quiet, the usual bustle of servants and staff noticeably absent. Marcello had arranged for a private dinner, just the two of them, in the intimate dining room reserved for family occasions. He was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. He was dressed in a dark suit, impeccably tailored, that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. He looked devastatingly handsome. You look stunning, he said, his voice a low murmur, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that sent a shiver of heat through her. Thank you, she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. He offered her his arm, his touch formal but possessive. She took it, her fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of his sleeve, the warmth of his skin radiating through. He led her through the silent hallways, to the dining room, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand ballroom where they had hosted their engagement party. The room was lit by candlelight, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of romantic intimacy. A table was set for two, with fine china, crystal glasses, and a centerpiece of fragrant white roses. The air was filled with the aroma of delicious food, a tantalizing blend of spices and herbs. Marcelo pulled out her chair, his movements graceful and attentive. He seated her, then took his place opposite her, his eyes never leaving hers. A single servant, silent and discreet, poured wine into their glasses, then disappeared, leaving them alone. "I had the chef prepare some of your favorites," Marcelo said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Dishes you enjoyed when you visited before." Alessia remembered those visits, the awkward formality of the dinners, the constant awareness of the arranged marriage that loomed over her. She had been a different person then, naive and rebellious, desperate to escape the constraints of her family. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That was thoughtful." They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of silverware against china. Alessia picked at her food, her appetite diminished by the nervous tension that coiled in her stomach. She could feel Marcelo's eyes on her, watching her, assessing her, waiting. Finally, he put down his fork, his gaze locking with hers. "Alessia," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk." She knew what was coming. The unspoken promises, the terms of their agreement, the reality of their real marriage. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation that would define their future. "I know," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped together. "I made a promise to protect you," he said, "to protect your family. And I intend to keep that promise. But at what cost?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "The cost is us," he said. "Our marriage. Our life together. A true partnership, Alessia. Not just in name, but in every way." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the determination in his gaze, the unwavering resolve. But she also saw something else, something that surprised her. She saw a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of longing, a desire that mirrored her own. She began, but her voice trailed off, her mind struggling to find the right words. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he said, his voice softer now. "But we can make this work. We can build something real." His words, his touch, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through her. Fear, yes, but also a strange, unexpected sense of hope. She had entered into this marriage out of desperation, out of a need for protection. But perhaps, just perhaps, it could be more than that. Perhaps, in this gilded cage, she could find something unexpected, something she had never dared to dream of. A connection. A partnership. Even love. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on their faces, reflecting the uncertainty and the possibility that lay before them. She looked at his hand holding hers, the strength and the unexpected tenderness. This was her life now. This was her husband. This was her future. And as she looked at him, she finally allowed herself a sliver of real hope, delicate as the rose petals adorning the table, to unfurl in her heart. Chapter 8. A Dance of Danger and Desire. The weeks that followed were a carefully choreographed dance, a delicate balance between the public facade of their marriage and the private reality of their complex relationship. Alessia found herself increasingly drawn into Marcelo's world, a world of power, intrigue, and hidden dangers. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of their society, to decipher the unspoken rules, to play the role of the supportive wife while concealing her own growing ambivalence. Marcelo remained an enigma, a man of contradictions. He was attentive and protective, showering her with gifts and gestures of affection, but he also maintained a distance, a wall of reserve that she couldn't quite penetrate. He treated her with a possessive courtesy, a subtle assertion of his ownership, but he never forced himself upon her, never demanded more than she was willing to give. Their nights were a testament to this unspoken tension. They shared the same bed, the vast, opulent space a constant reminder of their proximity and their distance. They would lie awake, separated by a chasm of unspoken words, their bodies close but not touching, the silence filled with a palpable tension, a mixture of desire and apprehension. Alessia found herself increasingly fascinated by Marcello, by the layers of complexity that she glimpsed beneath his carefully constructed facade. She saw the ruthlessness, the cold calculation that made him such a formidable leader. But she also saw moments of vulnerability, flashes of humor, and a deep-seated loyalty to those he cared for. She began to understand the weight of his responsibilities, the burden of leadership that he carried. She saw the toll it took on him, the constant pressure, the ever-present threat of betrayal. She started to see not just the Don but the man. One evening, they were attending a charity gala, a lavish affair hosted by one of the city's most influential families. Alessia was dressed in a stunning gown of midnight blue, the fabric shimmering with embedded crystals, a necklace of diamonds gracing her throat, a gift from Marcello. She felt like a princess, beautiful and admired, but also like an imposter, playing a role she didn't fully understand. Marcello was at her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that sent a shiver of awareness through her. He guided her through the crowded ballroom, introducing her to a seemingly endless stream of dignitaries, politicians, and business tycoons. She smiled and nodded, exchanging polite conversation, while her mind raced, trying to keep track of the names, the faces, the intricate web of relationships that define their world. She noticed the way people looked at Marcello, a mixture of respect and fear. She saw the deference they showed him, the careful way they chose their words. She realized that she was married to one of the most powerful men in the city, a man who commanded loyalty and inspired fear in equal measure. As the evening wore on, Alessia began to feel a growing sense of unease. She noticed the subtle glances, the whispered conversations, the eyes that followed them as they moved through the room. She sensed a tension in the air, a feeling of something brewing beneath the surface. She caught sight of Sal DeMarco, Marcello's trusted capo, standing in a corner, his eyes scanning the crowd, his expression grim. She saw Tony the Knife Bellini, his hand never far from the gun he concealed beneath his jacket. She realized that even in this glittering ballroom, surrounded by wealth and power, danger lurked, a constant threat that never truly disappeared. Later, as they danced, Marcello pulled her closer, his body pressed against hers, his breath warm on her ear. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "You seem distracted." She began, but hesitated, unsure how to express the unease she felt. "It's the Falcons," he said, his voice tight, his eyes scanning the room. "They're here." Alessia's heart skipped a beat. The Falcons. Their rivals. Their enemies. Their presence at the gala was a blatant provocation, a challenge to Marcello's authority. "What are they doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Making a statement," he replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "Testing the waters. Trying to unsettle us." Alessia felt a surge of fear, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She knew the history between the two families, the blood feud that had stretched back generations. She knew that violence could erupt at any moment, that their lives were constantly on the line. But as she looked into Marcello's eyes, she saw not fear, but a steely determination, a fierce protectiveness that both reassured and alarmed her. He would protect her, she knew that. But at what cost? The music changed, a slow, sensual melody that filled the room. Marcello pulled her even closer, his body molding against hers, his movements fluid and graceful. They danced in silence, their bodies communicating what their words could not. Alessia felt a surge of desire, a longing that surprised her with its intensity. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his power, his dangerous allure. She had told herself she did it out of duty, out of self-preservation, but in the dim light of the ballroom, surrounded by their enemies, she realized her feelings were becoming more complicated. The dance floor seemed to shrink, the other couples fading into a blur.
It was just them.
And the simmering threat of the Falcon presence, a threat that only intensified the sudden heat that flared between her and Marcello. The music swelled, reaching a crescendo as if mirroring the emotions building within her. Chapter 9. The cracks in the foundation of loyalty. The gala ended without incident, but the tension remained, a palpable undercurrent that followed them back to the Palazzo Ricci. Alessia felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of something dark and dangerous looming on the horizon. The Falcones' presence had been a deliberate provocation, a sign that the fragile peace between the families was on the verge of shattering. In the days that followed, Marcello became increasingly withdrawn, his usual reserve deepening into a brooding silence. He spent hours locked in his study, meeting with his capos, poring over documents, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with worry. Alessia tried to reach him, to break through the wall he had erected around himself, but he remained distant, his thoughts consumed by the looming threat of war. She sensed that he was keeping something from her, that there were secrets he was unwilling to share. One afternoon, she found him on the terrace, staring out at the city sprawling below, his expression troubled. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the outdoor space. "Marcello," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "What's wrong?" He turned, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze intense but guarded. "Nothing," he said, his voice flat, unconvincing. Alessia knew he was lying. She could see it in his eyes, in the tense set of his jaw, in the way he held himself, coiled and ready for action. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice firmer now, her own anxiety rising. "Something's happening. I can feel it." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, his expression softening slightly.
"It's complicated," he said.
"Business. Things you don't need to worry about." "I'm your wife," she said, her voice laced with a hint of defiance. "I do need to worry. I need to know what's going on." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether to trust her, to confide in her. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "There's been a betrayal," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Someone within our organization is working with the Falcones." Alessia's heart skipped a beat. A betrayal. The word sent a shiver of fear down her spine. The implications were terrifying. It meant that no one was safe, that trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes clouding with suspicion. "I don't know," he said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The uncertainty in his voice, the doubt that shadowed his gaze, sent a chill through her. He didn't know who to trust. And if he couldn't trust his own men, who could he trust? "How can you be sure?" Alessia asked, trying to make sense of what he was saying, wanting to believe it couldn't be true. "Information," he said grimly.
"Leaks.
Movements of goods that shouldn't be moving. Meetings that shouldn't be happening. Someone is feeding information to the Falcones, allowing them to anticipate our every move." Alessia felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling of being trapped in a web of deceit and danger. She realized that her life, her safety, depended on Marcello's ability to uncover the traitor, to expose the enemy within. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned back to the cityscape, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I'm going to find them," he said, his voice cold and determined. "And I'm going to make them pay." His words, spoken with such quiet intensity, sent a shiver of both fear and admiration through her. She knew he was capable of ruthlessness, of violence. But she also saw his unwavering loyalty to his family, his determination to protect those he cared for. She reached out, touching his arm, her fingers brushing against the tense muscles beneath his shirt. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of vulnerability in their depths. "Be careful," she said, her voice a heartfelt plea. "Please." He covered her hand with his grip firm and reassuring. "I will," he said. "I promise you." But as Alessia looked into his eyes, she saw a shadow of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty that belied his confident words. She knew that the danger was real, that the threat was imminent. And she knew that their lives were about to change, irrevocably, in ways she could not yet imagine. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, a sound that echoed the growing storm within their world. Chapter 10. Unraveling the Threads of Deceit. The hunt for the traitor consumed Marcelo. He became a man obsessed, driven by a need for justice, for retribution. He interrogated his men, questioned their loyalty, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. The Palazzo Ricci, once a place of opulent calm, became a fortress, filled with tension and suspicion. Alessia watched him, her heart aching for the burden he carried. She saw the toll it took on him, the lines of exhaustion etched on his face, the dark circles under his eyes. She tried to offer him comfort, to provide a semblance of normalcy in their increasingly chaotic world, but he remained distant, his mind consumed by the hunt. She found herself drawn into the investigation, her sharp mind and keen observation skills proving surprisingly useful. She had grown up in this world, had learned to read between the lines, to decipher the unspoken cues, to understand the intricate web of relationships that define their society. She began to notice things that Marcelo, blinded by his own anger and suspicion, had overlooked. She saw the subtle glances, the whispered conversations, the inconsistencies in the stories of his men. She started to piece together the puzzle, to unravel the threads of deceit that had been woven so carefully. One evening, she was in the library, poring over the records of their family's business dealings, when she noticed a discrepancy. A series of payments made to a shell corporation that didn't seem to align with any legitimate transactions. She traced the money, following the trail through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, until she discovered the ultimate recipient, a known associate of the Falcone family. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of excitement and fear. She had found something, a concrete piece of evidence that could lead them to the traitor. She knew she had to tell Marcelo, but she hesitated, a sense of unease gnawing at her. She had learned over the past few weeks that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, difficult to repair. She didn't know who Marcelo could trust, who within his inner circle might be involved in the betrayal. She decided to investigate further, to gather more evidence before revealing her discovery. She spent the next few days immersed in the records, tracing the flow of money, uncovering a network of corruption that reached deep into their organization. She discovered that the traitor had been feeding information to the Falcones for months, providing them with details of their shipments, their security protocols, their business strategies. The more she learned, the more dangerous the situation became. She realized that she was playing a deadly game, that one wrong move could expose her, could put her life in danger. But she couldn't stop. She was driven by a need to protect Marcelo, to help him uncover the truth, to save their family from destruction. Finally, she had enough. She had a name, a face, a concrete link between the traitor and the Falcones. She knew she had to tell Marcelo, but she also knew that she had to be careful. She couldn't risk alerting the traitor, giving them a chance to escape or to retaliate. She found Marcelo in his study, his face grim, his eyes shadowed with frustration. He was surrounded by his capos, their expressions tense and suspicious. The atmosphere in the room was thick with distrust, with the unspoken fear of betrayal. Alessia hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that what she was about to say would change everything, that it would unleash a storm of violence and retribution. But she had no choice. She had to tell him the truth. "Marcelo," she said, her voice clear and steady, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "I know who the traitor is." A hush fell over the room, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. All eyes turned to her, their expressions a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and suspicion. Marcelo stared at her, his gaze intense, his jaw clenched. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Alessia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the revelation that would shatter their world. She looked directly at the man she was about to accuse, her eyes locking with his. The color drained from his face. It was Lorenzo, her own brother. The room held its breath, every eye on Alessia and the man she'd just accused. Chapter 11. The Price of Protection and Power. The silence that followed Alessia's accusation was deafening, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from various corners of the room. All eyes were fixed on Lorenzo, who stood frozen, his face ashen, his youthful features contorted in a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Marcello's gaze shifted from Alessia to Lorenzo, his eyes narrowing, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken threat of violence hanging heavy in the room. "Lorenzo?" Marcello said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, the name laced with disbelief and a simmering rage. "Is this true?" Lorenzo stammered, his usual bravado deserting him. I don't know what she's talking about," he said, his voice trembling, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "She's lying. She's always been jealous, always trying to cause trouble." Alessia stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, her chin lifted in defiance. "I have proof," she said, her voice clear and steady, her eyes locking with Marcello's. "Financial records, transactions, communications. Everything points to him." She walked towards Marcello's desk, her movements deliberate and confident. She spread out the documents she had gathered, the evidence she had painstakingly compiled, laying bare the trail of deceit that led directly to Lorenzo. Marcello examined the documents, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. He saw the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the payments to known Falcone associates. He saw the irrefutable evidence of Lorenzo's betrayal. The other capos in the room crowded around, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and anger. They had trusted Lorenzo, had considered him one of their own. The realization that he had betrayed them, that he had been working with their enemies, was a bitter pill to swallow. "Lorenzo," Marcello said again, his voice now devoid of any emotion, cold and hard as steel. "Explain yourself." Lorenzo's facade of denial crumbled. He knew he was caught, that there was no escape. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. I was in debt," he mumbled, his voice muffled by his hands. "Gambling debts. The Falcones, they offered to help me. They said it was just information. I didn't know it would lead to this." His words were met with derision and contempt. The capos glared at him, their faces twisted in disgust. They had risked their lives for this family, had shown unwavering loyalty. And Lorenzo had betrayed them for money, for personal gain. Marco, his face a mask of pain and disbelief, stepped forward. He looked at his younger brother, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. He had always protected Lorenzo, had always made excuses for his impulsive behavior. But this was unforgivable. "You betrayed us," Marco said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You betrayed our father's legacy. You betrayed our family." Lorenzo looked up, his eyes filled with tears, his face contorted with remorse. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Marcello stood, his presence dominating the room. He looked at Lorenzo, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Sorry is not enough," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You knew the rules. You knew the consequences." He turned to his capos, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "Take him," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion.
"And deal with him."
Alessia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what that meant. Dealing with him was a euphemism for execution. She had exposed Lorenzo, had brought his betrayal to light. But she hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted him to die. He was her brother after all. "Marcello," she said, her voice pleading, her eyes searching his. "Please. There must be another way." He looked at her, his expression unyielding. "There is no other way," he said. He broke the code. He betrayed the family. He must pay the price. Two of the capos grabbed Lorenzo, dragging him from the room, his cries of protest echoing in the hallway. Alessia watched him go, her heart breaking, her mind reeling from the swift and brutal justice of their world. She turned to Marcello, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't want him to die. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb wiping away a tear that traced a path down her cheek. "I know," he said, his voice softer now, his eyes filled with a flicker of understanding. "But it had to be done." He was a threat.
To us. To the family.
He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. She buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with sobs. She had done what was right, what was necessary. But the price of protection, the price of power, was far higher than she had ever imagined. The weight of that realization settled upon her, heavy and suffocating. She clung to him, finding a strange comfort in his strength, in his unwavering resolve, even as she mourned the loss of her brother and the innocence she had once possessed. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. The weeks following Lorenzo's execution were shrouded in a heavy silence. The Palazzo Ricci felt like a tomb, the air thick with grief, guilt, and unspoken recriminations. Alessia found herself haunted by the memory of her brother, by the role she had played in his death. She had done what was necessary, what was right, but the weight of her actions pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the brutal realities of their world. Marcello, too, was affected by Lorenzo's death, though he tried to conceal it beneath his usual mask of cold indifference. Alessia saw the shadows in his eyes, the lines of exhaustion etched on his face, the subtle tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. She knew that he, too, carried a burden of guilt, a sense of responsibility for the tragedy that had unfolded. They moved through their days like ghosts, their interactions strained and formal. The easy camaraderie, the flickering moments of connection that had begun to develop between them, were gone, replaced by a chasm of silence and unspoken pain. Alessia tried to reach out to him, to offer comfort, to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but he remained distant, his thoughts consumed by the aftermath of Lorenzo's betrayal and the ongoing threat of the Falcons. She found solace in her work, immersing herself in the details of their family's business, using her sharp mind and keen observation skills to help Marcello navigate the treacherous waters of their world. She proved to be a valuable asset, her insights and strategies helping to stabilize their position, to protect them from their enemies. She also discovered a hidden talent for diplomacy, for negotiating with rival families, for forging alliances that strengthened their position. She realized that she had a power of her own, a power that didn't rely on violence or intimidation, but on intelligence, on persuasion, on the ability to connect with people on a human level. One afternoon, she was in the gardens, seeking a moment of peace amidst the turmoil that surrounded them. She was sitting by a fountain, the gentle sound of the water soothing her frayed nerves, when Marcello found her. He stood for a moment, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, he sat down beside her, his presence a welcome warmth in the cool shade of the trees. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice low and direct, cutting through the silence that had grown between them. Alessia looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his gaze, the unspoken questions that hung between them. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Everything feels so broken." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the fountain, his expression softening slightly. "I know," he said. "It's difficult. But we can't let it destroy us. We can't let them win." "Them?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "The Falcons," he clarified. "Lorenzo's betrayal. It was all orchestrated by them, Alessia. They used him, manipulated him, to weaken us, to destabilize our family." Alessia felt a surge of anger, a renewed sense of purpose. She had been so consumed by her own guilt, by her grief over Lorenzo's death, that she had forgotten the true enemy, the force that had orchestrated their tragedy. "We need to fight back," she said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with determination. "We need to show them that we're not broken, that we're stronger than ever." Marcello looked at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of admiration. He saw the fire in her gaze, the resilience that had always been there, buried beneath layers of grief and guilt. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "We will," he said. Together. His words, his touch, sent a wave of hope through her, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had enveloped them. She realized that she was not alone, that she had a partner, an ally, in Marcelo. They had been brought together by tragedy, by desperation, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something real, something strong, from the ashes of their shattered world. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "I need you, Alessia," he whispered, his breath warm on her skin. "I need your strength, your intelligence, your heart." His words, spoken with such raw vulnerability, touched her deeply. She saw the man beneath the mask, the human being who had been wounded by betrayal, by loss, by the constant pressure of leadership. She squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "And I need you," she said, her voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even her. They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their gazes locked, the unspoken promises between them finally acknowledged. The fountain continued its gentle song, a soothing melody that seemed to wash away the pain, the guilt, the fear. They were not healed. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, Alessia felt a flicker of hope, a belief that they could overcome the darkness, that they could find a way to build a future together. A future forged not just by duty or obligation, but by something real, something lasting, something like love. The sun, breaking through the clouds, cast a warm, golden light upon them. Chapter 13. The Gathering Storm of Revelation. The renewed sense of purpose that had sparked between Alessia and Marcelo spurred them into action. They began to work together, pooling their resources, their intelligence, their determination, to counter the Falcons' threat and to rebuild the trust within their own organization. Alessia took on a more prominent role, attending meetings with Marcelo, advising him on strategy, negotiating with rival families. She discovered a natural talent for diplomacy, for forging alliances, for navigating the complex web of relationships that define their world. She was no longer just the Don's wife, the pawn in a strategic marriage. She was a force to be reckoned with, a partner, an advisor, a leader in her own right. Marcelo, in turn, began to rely on Alessia more and more, trusting her judgment, valuing her insights, seeking her counsel. He saw the strength she possessed, the resilience that had allowed her to overcome her grief and guilt, to emerge from the darkness stronger than before. He admired her intelligence, her courage, her unwavering loyalty. Their relationship began to shift, to evolve. The distance that had separated them after Lorenzo's death began to close, replaced by a growing sense of intimacy, of mutual respect, of shared purpose. They spent hours together, discussing strategy, planning their next moves, their conversations ranging from the practicalities of running their organization to the deeper, more personal issues that had haunted them. One evening, they were working late in Marcelo's study, poring over documents, analyzing intelligence reports, trying to anticipate the Falcons' next move. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the weight of their responsibilities pressing down on them. Alessia noticed a pattern in the Falcons' recent activities, a series of seemingly unrelated incidents that, when viewed together, revealed a clear strategy. They were targeting the DeSantis family's legitimate businesses, their front companies, trying to cripple them financially, to weaken their position before launching a full-scale assault. "Marcelo," she said, her voice urgent, her eyes fixed on the documents spread out before her. "Look at this. They're not just trying to intimidate us. They're preparing for war." Marcelo examined the evidence, his eyes narrowing, his expression hardening. He saw the pattern, the clear and deliberate strategy. He realized that Alessia was right, that the Falcons were planning a major offensive, a move that could shatter their family, destroy everything they had built. "We need to act quickly," he said, his voice grim, his mind already racing, formulating a plan. "We need to strike first, before they have a chance to cripple us." They spent the rest of the night devising a counter-strategy, a plan to disrupt the Falcons' operations, to expose their vulnerabilities, to hit them where it hurt the most. They worked together seamlessly, their minds in sync, their skills complementing each other perfectly. As the night wore on, Alessia felt a growing sense of excitement, a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a grieving sister, a reluctant bride. She was a warrior, a strategist, a leader. She was fighting for her family, for her future, for the man she was beginning to realize she loved. But amidst this newfound purpose, a nagging doubt began to surface. Alessia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Lorenzo's betrayal, something Marcello was still keeping from her. He had said the Falcones orchestrated it, but she sensed there were details, hidden truths, that he hadn't revealed. She decided to confront him, to demand the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. She found him on the terrace, staring out at the city lights, his expression troubled. "Marcello," she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes searching his. "We need to talk." "About Lorenzo." He turned to her, his gaze guarded, his expression unreadable. "What about him?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I need to know everything," she said. "The whole truth. No more secrets. No more lies." He hesitated, his eyes clouding with a mixture of pain and reluctance. He seemed to be wrestling with himself, struggling to decide whether to reveal the truth. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, his expression softening slightly. "There are things you don't know," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Things about Lorenzo, about our family, about me." He paused, taking a deep breath, steeling himself for the revelation that was about to come. "Lorenzo wasn't just in debt," he said. "He was involved with someone. Someone from the Falcone family." Alessia's eyes widened in shock. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcello looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Sofia Falcone," he said. "Don Falcone's daughter." The revelation hit Alessia like a physical blow, a storm of emotions swirling within her. Chapter 14. When Trust Becomes a Weapon. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a truth that shattered Alessia's perception of her brother, of her family, of everything she thought she knew. Sofia Falcone, the daughter of their sworn enemy. The woman Lorenzo had supposedly loved. The woman who had, perhaps, manipulated him, used him, led him to his death. Sofia, Alessia repeated, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications of Marcello's revelation, trying to reconcile the image of her impulsive, reckless brother with the idea of a forbidden romance, a dangerous liaison that had ended in tragedy. How long?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching Marcello's. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "A few months," he said. Before he ran off with you." Alessia's heart sank. The timeline overlapped. Lorenzo's elopement with her, his supposed love for her, had been a lie, a cover for his secret affair with Sofia. She had been a pawn, used by both her brother and the Falcones, to further their own agendas. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of accusation, her eyes searching Marcello's for any sign of deception. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't have proof. But I knew something was wrong. Lorenzo was different, distracted, reckless." "And you didn't tell me?" she asked, her voice rising in anger, her heart aching with a renewed sense of betrayal. "I tried to protect you," he said, his voice defensive, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't want you to get hurt." "Protect me?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "By keeping secrets? By lying to me?" "It wasn't a lie," he said. "It was an omission. I didn't know the full extent of it. And I didn't want to believe it. Lorenzo was family." Alessia felt a surge of anger, a wave of betrayal that washed over her. She had trusted Marcello, had confided in him, had relied on him. And he had kept this from her, had hidden a truth that had shattered her world. I thought we were partners," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought we were in this together." "We are," he said, reaching out to her, his hand grasping hers. "But sometimes, protecting someone means keeping them in the dark." shielding them from the ugliness, from the pain. Alessia pulled her hand away, her eyes flashing with anger. "That's not protection," she said. "That's control. That's manipulation." She turned away from him, her back to him, her body shaking with emotion. She felt lost, betrayed, alone. The trust she had placed in Marcelo, the fragile bond that had begun to form between them, had been shattered. Marcelo moved closer, his presence behind her a source of both comfort and pain. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch gentle but firm. "Alessia," he said, his voice soft, pleading. "Please. Try to understand. I did what I thought was best. I was trying to protect you.
To protect our family."
She turned back to him, her eyes filled with tears, her face contorted with a mixture of anger and hurt. "By lying to me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "By keeping secrets that could have saved Lorenzo's life?" He flinched at her words, his eyes clouding with guilt. He knew she was right, that his actions, however well-intentioned, had contributed to the tragedy. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice filled with remorse. "I should have told you. I should have trusted you." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb wiping away a tear that traced a path down her cheek. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice a heartfelt plea. "Please forgive me." Alessia looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain in his gaze, the sincerity of his remorse. She knew he had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But she also knew that he had done it out of love, out of a misguided attempt to protect her. The anger began to subside, replaced by a wave of exhaustion, of resignation. She was tired of fighting, tired of the secrets, tired of the constant threat of betrayal. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his, her body trembling with emotion. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you. But I don't want to lose you." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his embrace a source of comfort and strength. "You won't," he said, his voice firm, reassuring. "I promise you. I'll earn back your trust. I'll do whatever it takes." He held her close, and the storm within her, while not gone, began to quiet. The night stretched out before them, filled with uncertainty and unspoken fears, but for the first time since the devastating revelation, Alessia felt a glimmer of hope that their bond, though damaged, might still be salvaged. Chapter 15. The Ghosts That Haunt the Present. The revelation of Lorenzo's affair with Sofia Falcone cast a long shadow, complicating their efforts to retaliate against the Falcones and deepening the rift between Alessia and Marcelo. While Alessia struggled to rebuild her trust in Marcelo, she also found herself grappling with a renewed sense of grief and anger over her brother's death. The knowledge that his betrayal had been fueled by a forbidden love, a secret romance with their enemy, added another layer of pain and complexity to her already conflicted emotions. Marcelo, burdened by guilt and determined to regain Alessia's trust, redoubled his efforts to protect their family and to bring the Falcones to justice. He knew that he had made a mistake, that his attempt to shield Alessia from the truth had backfired, causing her even greater pain. He was determined to make amends, to prove to her that he was worthy of her trust, of her love. He began to include Alessia in every aspect of their operations, sharing information, seeking her counsel, treating her as a true partner. He showed her the respect she deserved, acknowledging her intelligence, her courage, her unwavering loyalty. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, that he had to earn back her trust through his deeds, not just his apologies. Alessia, despite her lingering anger and hurt, found herself drawn back to Marcelo, her heart unable to deny the connection that still existed between them. She saw his remorse, his determination to make amends, his unwavering commitment to protecting their family. She recognized that his actions, however misguided, had been motivated by love, by a desire to shield her from pain. She began to work with him again, their collaboration fueled by a shared purpose, a determination to overcome the challenges that faced them. She used her sharp mind and keen observation skills to analyze intelligence reports, to identify vulnerabilities in the Falcones' operations, to devise strategies that would cripple their enemies and protect their own interests. One evening, as they were working late in Marcello's study, Alessia discovered a hidden compartment in Lorenzo's old desk. Inside, she found a collection of love letters, written by Sofia Falcone to Lorenzo. The letters revealed the depth of their relationship, the passion that had driven them to betray their families, to risk everything for their forbidden love. As Alessia read the letters, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anger, yes, at Sofia for manipulating her brother, for using him to further her family's agenda. But also pity. Pity for two young people caught in a web of hatred and violence, their love a casualty of a feud that had stretched back generations. She showed the letters to Marcello, her heart aching with a renewed sense of grief and loss. He read them silently, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. They were fools, he said, his voice low and bitter. They let their emotions cloud their judgment. They paid the ultimate price. Alessia nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. But they were also victims, she said. Victims of our family's hatred, of a feud that should have ended long ago. Marcello looked at her, his gaze softening. He saw the compassion in her eyes, the empathy that she felt even for her enemies. He realized that Alessia possessed a strength that he lacked, a capacity for forgiveness that he could only admire. He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. We can't change the past, he said. But we can learn from it. We can break the cycle of violence, of hatred. We can build a better future. His words, spoken with such conviction, resonated with Alessia. She saw the hope in his eyes, the determination to create a new legacy, a legacy not of blood and betrayal, but of peace and reconciliation. She squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Together, she said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. We can do it together. As they sat there, in the quiet of the study, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, they made a silent vow. A vow to honor the memory of those they had lost, to break free from the chains of hatred and violence, to build a future where love, not fear, would be the guiding force. The letters, a testament to a tragic love, served as a reminder of the cost of hatred and the enduring power of forgiveness. And they both, separately, began to feel that perhaps the future could be different. The clock ticked, marking the passage of time, and also marking a silent turning point. Chapter 16. A Reckoning with the Past. The discovery of Sofia's letters spurred Alessia to seek a confrontation, a reckoning with the woman who had played such a pivotal role in her brother's death and the ongoing conflict between their families. She knew it was a risky move, a dangerous gamble, but she felt compelled to understand Sofia's motives, to hear her side of the story, to find some semblance of closure. Marcello, initially hesitant, eventually agreed to Alessia's request. He recognized her need for answers, her desire to confront the past, to break free from the chains of hatred and violence that had bound their families for generations. He also saw an opportunity, a chance to gain intelligence, to understand the Falcone strategy, to find a way to end the conflict once and for all. He arranged a meeting, a secret rendezvous in a neutral location, a small, unassuming church on the outskirts of the city. He took precautions, ensuring Alessia's safety, surrounding the church with his most trusted men, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Alessia entered the church alone, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old wood, the silence broken only by the faint sound of her own footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Sofia Falcone was waiting for her, standing by the altar, her back to the entrance. She was dressed in black, her dark hair cascading down her back, her figure slender and elegant. She turned as Alessia approached, her eyes meeting Alessia's, her expression unreadable. You came, Sofia said, her voice soft but firm, her gaze unwavering. I did, Alessia replied, her voice equally steady, her eyes searching Sofia's for any sign of remorse, of regret, of understanding. The two women stood in silence for a long moment, their gazes locked, the weight of their shared history, their intertwined destinies, hanging heavy in the air. They were enemies, yes, but they were also victims, bound together by a tragedy that had shattered both their lives. I wanted to understand, Alessia said, her voice breaking the silence, her words laced with a mixture of anger and pain.
Why?
Why did you do it? Why did you manipulate my brother? Why did you betray your own family? Sophia's expression softened slightly, a flicker of sadness crossing her features.
It wasn't like that, she said.
I loved Lorenzo. I truly loved him. Love? Alessia repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. You call that love? You used him. You led him to his death. I know, Sophia said, her voice filled with remorse. And I'll live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But it wasn't a calculated move. It wasn't part of some grand strategy. We were young, foolish. We thought we could overcome anything, even our family's hatred. Alessia listened, her anger slowly giving way to a grudging understanding. She saw the pain in Sophia's eyes, the sincerity of her regret. She realized that Sophia, like Lorenzo, had been a victim of circumstance, caught in a web of violence and betrayal that had been spun long before they were born. He's dead, Alessia said, her voice choked with emotion. Because of us. Because of our families. Sophia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know, she said. And I'm so sorry. The two women stood in silence again, the weight of their shared grief, their shared loss, connecting them in a way that their family's hatred never could. There has to be another way, Alessia said, her voice filled with a sudden determination. We can't let this continue. We can't let more people die. Sophia looked at her, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope. Do you think it's possible?
She asked.
To end this? To find peace? I don't know, Alessia said. But we have to try. For Lorenzo. For all those who have died. For ourselves. The two women, enemies by birth, bound by tragedy, made a silent pact, a promise to work together, to find a way to break the cycle of violence, to build a future where love, not hatred, would prevail. It was a fragile hope, a dangerous gamble, but it was a start. As they left the church, separately, both women felt the weight of the task ahead, but also a flicker of possibility. The meeting, born of grief and a desire for understanding, had planted a seed of hope that might, just might, blossom into a lasting peace. The bells of the church began to toll, a somber sound, but also, perhaps, a sound of awakening. Chapter 17. The Fragile Bonds of a New Beginning. The meeting with Sophia marked a turning point, a shift in the dynamics of the conflict between the DeSantis and Falcone families. Alessia and Sophia, driven by a shared grief and a desire for peace, began to work together, secretly, cautiously, to find a way to end the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. It was a dangerous game, a delicate dance of trust and betrayal. They met in secret, exchanging information, sharing strategies, their conversations guarded, their movements carefully concealed. They knew that if their families discovered their collaboration, they would both be branded as traitors, their lives forfeit. But they were driven by a powerful force, a belief that a better future was possible, that love could triumph over hatred, that peace could prevail over violence. They were determined to honor the memory of Lorenzo, to create a world where their families could coexist, not as enemies, but as neighbors, as partners, as friends. Alessia shared her insights with Marcelo, carefully omitting Sophia's direct involvement, presenting their collaboration as her own strategic thinking. She knew that Marcelo, while softening, still harbored a deep-seated distrust of the Falcones, that he would never fully accept a partnership with Sophia. Marcelo, impressed by Alessia's intelligence and her growing influence, listened to her counsel, valued her insights, trusted her judgment. He saw the changes in her, the strength she had found, the leadership qualities that had emerged from the crucible of tragedy. He was proud of her, grateful for her support, his love for her deepening with each passing day. He also began to soften his own stance, to consider the possibility of a truce, of a negotiated settlement with the Falcons. He realized that the endless cycle of violence was unsustainable, that it would eventually destroy both families, leaving nothing but ruins and regrets. He was tired of the bloodshed, the constant threat of betrayal, the weight of leadership that had burdened him for so long. He began to make overtures, sending subtle signals to Don Falcone, indicating his willingness to negotiate, to find a way to end the conflict. He used Alessia as his intermediary, her diplomatic skills and her newfound connection with Sophia proving invaluable in bridging the gap between the two families. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, watching the sunset over the city, Marcello turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and love. "You've changed," he said, his voice soft, his gaze tender. "You've become stronger, more confident, more powerful." Alessia smiled, her heart warmed by his words.
"We've both changed," she said.
"We've been through so much. We've learned, we've grown." He reached out, taking her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "I love you, Alessia," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I haven't always shown it. I know I've made mistakes. But I love you, more than anything." Alessia's heart skipped a beat. She had longed to hear those words, had yearned for his love, for his acceptance. She had entered into this marriage out of desperation, out of a need for protection. But somewhere along the way, her feelings had changed, had deepened. She had fallen in love with him, with the man beneath the mask, with the strength and vulnerability that he had tried so hard to conceal. "I love you too, Marcello," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes meeting his, her heart overflowing with a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other, their shared hope for a future free from violence and hatred. The kiss deepened, a passionate expression of their love, their desire, their newfound trust. As they embraced, the city lights twinkled below them, a silent witness to their love, their hope, their fragile new beginning. The path ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still daunting, but they knew that as long as they had each other, as long as they held on to their love, they could overcome anything. The sunset, a blaze of color, seemed to bless their union, a promise of brighter days to come. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a quiet joy, a feeling that, finally, they were on the right path. Chapter 18. Where Loyalty and Love Collide. The fragile peace that Alessia and Marcello had begun to build with the Falcones was threatened when Don Falcone, old and ailing, succumbed to a sudden illness. His death threw the Falcone family into chaos, with various factions vying for control, threatening to reignite the feud with the DeSantis family. Sophia, despite her grief, stepped up, determined to honor her father's supposed legacy while secretly working towards the peace she and Alessia had envisioned. She knew that her position was precarious, that many within her family doubted her ability to lead, that they saw her as weak, as a pawn of the DeSantis family. She reached out to Alessia, seeking her support, her guidance, her friendship. Alessia, in turn, rallied Marcello, urging him to publicly support Sophia's claim to leadership, to demonstrate their commitment to peace, to prevent the Falcone family from descending into civil war. Marcello, initially hesitant, eventually agreed. He saw the wisdom in Alessia's plan, the opportunity to solidify their alliance with Sophia, to create a lasting peace between their families. He also trusted Alessia, his love for her overriding his long-held suspicions of the Falcones. He made a bold move, a public declaration of support for Sophia, a gesture that shocked both families, that sent ripples of unease and disbelief throughout their world. He stood beside Sophia at her father's funeral, a united front, a symbol of their commitment to peace, a challenge to those who sought to perpetuate the cycle of violence. His actions sparked outrage among some members of his own family, those who believed that he was betraying their legacy, that he was weakening their position, that he was consorting with the enemy. They saw Sophia as a threat, a manipulative woman who had seduced Lorenzo and was now trying to control Marcello. The most vocal opponent was Sal DeMarco, Marcello's longtime capo, the man who had been like a second father to him. Sal, hardened by years of conflict, deeply distrustful of the Falcones, saw Marcello's alliance with Sofia as a betrayal, a sign of weakness, a dangerous gamble that could cost them everything. He confronted Marcello, his voice filled with anger and disappointment. "You're making a mistake, Marcello," he said. "You're letting your feelings for that woman cloud your judgment. The Falcones can't be trusted. They'll betray you. They'll destroy us all." Marcello stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his voice firm. "I'm doing what I believe is right," he said. "I'm trying to build a better future. A future without bloodshed, without constant fear." "There is no future with them," Sal retorted, his voice laced with bitterness. "Only death and destruction." The argument escalated, the tension between the two men reaching a boiling point. Sal, blinded by his own prejudices, his own fears, accused Marcello of being blinded by love, of being manipulated by Alessia and Sofia. Alessia, who had been listening to the argument, stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Sal," she said, "you're wrong. We're not trying to betray anyone. We're trying to build peace. To end the cycle of violence." Sal turned to her, his eyes filled with disdain. "You," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're the one who's behind all this. You've poisoned his mind. You've turned him against his own family." Marcello stepped in front of Alessia, protecting her, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Don't you dare speak to her like that," he said. "She's my wife. She's my partner. And she's doing more for this family than you ever have." The confrontation ended in a stalemate, the tension between Marcello and Sal unresolved, a simmering threat that hung heavy in the air. Alessia knew that Sal's distrust, his resentment, could undermine everything they were trying to build, that it could lead to a new wave of violence, a new betrayal. She realized that their fragile peace, their newfound love, their hope for a better future, were all hanging by a thread. The loyalty of his oldest friend and the future he was trying to build with the woman he loved were now in direct opposition. And Marcello was trapped in the middle. As she watched the two men, the tension between them almost palpable, Alessia knew that a storm was coming, a storm that would test their strength, their loyalty, their love, to the breaking point. Chapter 19. The Ultimate Sacrifice for Freedom. The simmering tension between Marcello and Sal DeMarco finally erupted, triggered by a series of carefully orchestrated events designed to sow discord and undermine Marcello's leadership. Sal, convinced that Marcello's alliance with Sofia was a betrayal of their family's legacy, secretly began to conspire with factions within the Falcone family who opposed Sofia's leadership and sought to reignite the feud. He leaked information, spread rumors, manipulated events, all with the aim of discrediting Marcello and Alessia, of forcing a confrontation that would restore the old order, the old ways of violence and retribution. He believed he was acting in the best interests of the family, that he was saving them from destruction, but his actions were driven by fear, by prejudice, by a refusal to accept change. His plan culminated in a carefully staged ambush, an attack on a DeSantis family warehouse, designed to look like a Falcone operation, intended to provoke Marcello into retaliating, to shatter the fragile peace that had been so carefully constructed. Marcello, suspecting Sal's treachery but lacking concrete proof, found himself caught in a trap, his loyalty to his longtime capo warring with his commitment to Alessia and his belief in a peaceful future. He knew that if he retaliated against the Falcones, he would be playing into Sal's hands, destroying any chance of lasting peace, betraying Alessia's trust. But if he didn't respond, he would be seen as weak, as indecisive, losing the respect of his men, inviting further attacks. Alessia, sensing the danger, urged Marcello to be cautious, to investigate thoroughly, to find the truth before acting. She knew that Sal was capable of anything, that he was driven by a misguided sense of loyalty, a belief that he was protecting the family, even if it meant destroying everything they had worked so hard to build. She secretly reached out to Sofia, sharing her suspicions, seeking her help in uncovering Sal's plot. Sophia, equally committed to peace, agreed to cooperate, providing Alessia with intelligence, with access to sources within her own family, helping her to unravel the threads of deceit that Sal had woven so carefully. Together, Alessia and Sophia uncovered the truth, gathering evidence of Sal's treachery, of his collaboration with the Falcone factions, of his plan to reignite the feud. They realized that Sal was not just acting alone, that he had the support of others within the DeSantis family, those who opposed Marcelo's leadership, who longed for the old ways, the old power structures. They presented their findings to Marcelo, laying bare the evidence of Sal's betrayal, of his plan to destroy everything they had built. Marcelo, faced with the irrefutable proof of his longtime friend's treachery, was devastated, his heart torn between loyalty and the need for justice. He confronted Sal, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why, Sal?" he asked. "Why did you do this?" After all these years, after everything, Sal, his face hardened, his eyes filled with a defiant fanaticism, refused to back down. "I did it for the family," he said.
To protect us from them.
From her. He glared at Alessia. "You did it for yourself," Marcelo said, his voice filled with disgust. "You did it for power. You did it because you couldn't accept change. You couldn't accept that there was another way." The confrontation escalated, culminating in a violent showdown, a battle between those who sought peace and those who clung to the old ways of hatred and violence. Marcelo, forced to defend himself, to protect Alessia, to save their future, had no choice but to fight back. In the ensuing chaos, Sal, driven by a desperate need to silence Marcelo, to prevent him from exposing his treachery, lunged at him with a knife. Alessia, seeing the danger, reacted instinctively, throwing herself in front of Marcelo, shielding him with her own body. The knife plunged into her, a searing pain that stole her breath, a crimson stain that bloomed on her dress. Marcelo, horrified, caught her as she fell, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and anguish. He cradled her in his arms, his hands pressing against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Alessia," he cried, his voice choked with emotion. "No, please no." Alessia looked at him, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the pain, the fear, the impending darkness. "I love you," she whispered, her voice fading, her breath growing shallow. Don't let them win. Build the future we dreamed of." Her eyes closed, her body went limp, her life slipping away. Marcelo held her close, his tears falling onto her face, his heart shattered into a million pieces. He had lost her, the woman he loved, the woman who had shown him a different path, the woman who had sacrificed herself to save him. Sal, standing over them, his face a mask of horror and regret, realized the enormity of his actions, the destruction he had wrought. He had sought to protect the family, but he had destroyed it. He had killed the woman who had offered them a chance at redemption. The sound of sirens filled the air, the arrival of the authorities, alerted by the sounds of the battle. Marcelo's men, those who had remained loyal to him, subdued Sal and his co-conspirators, their faces filled with a mixture of grief and anger. Marcelo, numb with shock, his heart broken, allowed himself to be led away, his gaze fixed on Alessia's lifeless body, his world crumbling around him. He had won the battle, but he had lost everything that mattered. He'd lost her. The silence that fell was broken only by his ragged sobs. Chapter 20. A legacy redefined by choice. The world spun on, indifferent to Marcelo's grief. Alessia's sacrifice, however, had not been in vain. Her death, a tragic consequence of Sal's betrayal, galvanized Marcelo, strengthening his resolve to honor her memory, to build the future they had dreamed of together, a future free from violence and hatred. He used the evidence that Alessia and Sophia had gathered to expose Sal's treachery, to dismantle the conspiracy that had threatened to reignite the feud with the Falcones. He purged his own family of those who had supported Sal, those who clung to the old ways, those who refused to accept change. He reached out to Sophia, forging a true alliance, a partnership based on mutual respect, on a shared commitment to peace. They worked together, dismantling the old power structures, reforming their families' businesses, creating a new legacy, a legacy of cooperation, of understanding, of forgiveness. Marcello, guided by Alessia's memory, by her unwavering belief in a better future, became a different leader, a man transformed by grief and love. He was no longer the cold, ruthless Don, driven by power and vengeance. He was a peacemaker, a visionary, a man who had learned the true meaning of sacrifice, of loyalty, of love. He established a foundation in Alessia's name, a charity dedicated to helping victims of violence, to promoting education, to fostering understanding between different communities. He used his wealth and influence to create opportunities, to build bridges, to heal the wounds of the past. He never forgot Alessia, her memory a constant presence in his life, a guiding light that illuminated his path. He visited her grave every day, bringing her flowers, sharing his thoughts, his hopes, his dreams. He knew that she was gone, but her spirit lived on, in his heart, in his actions, in the legacy he was building in her name. Years passed. The city, once scarred by violence and division, began to heal. The DeSantis and Falcone families, once sworn enemies, learned to coexist, to cooperate, to build a future together. The old hatreds faded, replaced by a fragile but growing trust, a shared commitment to peace. Marcello, now an older man, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the marks of time and experience, stood before a crowd of people, a gathering of DeSantis and Falcone family members, community leaders, city officials. He was dedicating a new community center, a building named after Alessia, a symbol of hope, of reconciliation, of a new beginning. He spoke of Alessia, of her courage, her compassion, her unwavering belief in a better future. He spoke of the sacrifices they had made, the challenges they had overcome, the peace they had finally achieved. Alessia believed that love could conquer hatred, he said, his voice filled with emotion, his eyes glistening with tears. She believed that we could break the cycle of violence, that we could build a world where our children could live without fear. She gave her life for that belief. And it is our duty, our responsibility, to honor her memory, to make her dream a reality. His words resonated with the crowd, their hearts touched by his sincerity, by his unwavering commitment to Alessia's legacy. They saw in him a leader who had been transformed by love, a man who had found redemption in the ashes of tragedy. As he finished speaking, a young girl, Sophia's daughter, approached him, offering him a bouquet of white roses, Alessia's favorite flower. Marcello took the flowers, his hand trembling, his eyes meeting the girl's, a flicker of hope, of recognition, passing between them. He saw in her the future, a future free from the hatreds of the past, a future built on love, on understanding, on forgiveness. He saw Alessia's legacy, alive and well, in the eyes of the next generation. He smiled, a sad but grateful smile, his heart filled with a mixture of grief and hope. He had lost Alessia, but he had found something precious, something enduring. He had found peace. He had found purpose. He had found a way to honor her memory, to build a future worthy of her sacrifice. He looked out at the assembled crowd, and then, up at the clear sky, as if sending a message to Alessia. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, a gentle whisper that seemed to carry his words, his love, his promise, to the heavens. Epilogue. The seasons turned, years melting into decades. The community center, a testament to Alessia's vision, thrived, a vibrant hub of activity, a symbol of unity and progress. Marcello, though his steps were slower and his hair now completely silver, remained a guiding force, his wisdom and experience sought by all. He never remarried, his heart forever belonging to the woman who had shown him the true meaning of love and sacrifice. He often visited the small church where he and Alessia had met Sophia, the place where the seeds of peace had first been sown. He would sit in the quiet stillness, the scent of incense and old wood evoking memories of that fateful day, of Alessia's courage, of Sophia's willingness to risk everything for a better future. He also maintained a close relationship with Sophia, their bond forged in shared grief and a mutual commitment to peace. They had become unlikely friends, confidants, their families intertwined, their pasts a constant reminder of the price of hatred and the enduring power of forgiveness. Sophia had taken her place as the head of her family, ruling with a firm but compassionate hand. She often said that it was Alessia who had given her that courage. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marcello found himself drawn to Alessia's grave. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The leaves, turning shades of red and gold, rustled softly in the breeze, a gentle whisper that seemed to carry the voices of the past. He knelt by her headstone, his hand tracing the inscription, his heart filled with a familiar ache of loss, but also with a sense of profound gratitude. He had lived a long life, a life filled with both tragedy and triumph. He had lost the woman he loved, but he had found something precious in her absence, a purpose, a legacy, a peace that had eluded him for so long. He placed a bouquet of white roses on her grave, their fragrance mingling with the scent of fallen leaves, a sweet and poignant reminder of the love that had blossomed amidst the darkness. "I kept my promise, Alessia," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We built the future we dreamed of. A future of peace. A future of hope." He sat there for a long time, lost in thought, his mind drifting back to the moments they had shared, the challenges they had overcome, the love that had bound them together. He remembered her smile, her laughter, her unwavering belief in a better world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Marcello felt a sense of profound peace, a feeling of closure. He had lived a full life, a life dedicated to honoring Alessia's memory, to building a legacy worthy of her sacrifice. He stood slowly, his old bones aching, his heart heavy but full. He looked at her grave one last time, a silent farewell, a promise to carry her spirit with him always. As he walked away, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves, creating a symphony of whispers that seemed to echo Alessia's name, a gentle reminder of her enduring presence, of her unwavering love, of the legacy she had left behind. He paused, just at the edge of the cemetery, and looked back at the city sprawling before him. It was vibrant, alive, and at peace. He smiled, a small, sad smile, but a smile of contentment nonetheless. He had done what he'd set out to do. He had kept his promise. And in doing so, he had finally found his own peace.